Uh, oh, great. Okay. Tonight we have a fascinating presentation by Buff's member, educator, and historian Diana McCarthy. Diana has put together a living history presentation using as her source a series of intriguing Civil War letters of Peter and Clarinda Dumont. Peter was enlisted in the 146th New York Volunteers and also happens to be Diana's great-great-great-grandfather. He was an engaging writer and illustrated his correspondence with some lighthearted sketches. Diana discovered a box of these letters in amongst her family's papers. She has since donated the letters to the New York State Archives so that scholars, historians, and the public can enjoy them. But I understand she kept the box. The program will be in part first-person living history interpretation and part documentary. The colorful soldiers known as Zouaves figure prominently in the action. Zouave reenactor and expert Skip Griffiths will provide some background on New York Zouaves and their uniforms. And I understand that Mark Bodner will tell a little bit about some of those Zouaves that are interred in Albany Rural Cemetery. Diana is a retired teacher and public administrator. She lives in Del Mar with her husband, Brian. She has a master's degree in education from the College of St. Rose. She has taught in public and private schools, as well as adult education and administrating training for New York State agencies. She enjoys volunteering at Five Rivers, participating in historical societies, and researching her family's Civil War history. You may have seen her recently on Channel 10 News special report, where she was interviewed by Anya Tucker about the letters. As usual, there will be a question and answer session after the presentation. You can use chat for the questions, or you can raise your hands the old-fashioned way. Please remember to keep your Zoom microphone on mute during the presentation until we get to the Q&A part of it. If all goes well with the recording, and we hope it will, the presentation will be posted to the Buff's very own YouTube site, where it will join other recent presentations. So sit back and listen to the accounts of Army life, battles such as Chancellorsville, and the rigors of captivity in Richmond's notorious Libby prison, and experience the Civil War story of Peter and Clarinda Dumont.
Thank you so much, Stuart. That was a wonderful introduction. And thank you very much to DeBuffs for giving me this opportunity to share my family's Civil War letters. And thank you all for being here today as we talk a little bit about them and give you an overview of the story. This is really the first time that these letters have been shared with the public. As Stuart said, they were passed down to me in a cardboard box. I'll give you a little closer up of it. You probably can't read this letter, but the box was filled with 80 letters, and the writing on the top of it says, letters from my father to my mother, war letters from the place where I was born, 97 Lafayette Street, Utica, New York. And I believe these were written by Peter and Clarinda Dumont's only daughter, Ida. The letters have just been transcribed for the first time from Peter's service as a Union soldier. He was born in Seward in Schoharie County, but moved to Utica with his family as a teenager. And he wrote to his wife, Clarinda, who was my 3 times great grandmother. And I'm actually portraying her today in this beautiful dress that my sister handmade for me. And I'll just do a shout out to Laura Spickerman, one of our members, who gave me a lot of good advice on making period dresses and how to do reenactments as well. Now, this would have been done as a in-person reenactment, and hopefully when we get back to doing in-person meetings, I can share some of my great props. I was hoping to portray Clarinda working in her kitchen. I have a lovely antique mixing bowl and a couple of props that Bob Mulligan has shared with me, including a Borden's condensed milk can and a bottle from that era, which I've decorated as a Utica Club cream ale bottle. Now, these letters, as Stuart mentioned, are in the New York State Library Museum archives, but I have a photocopy of one here to show you, and you'll be seeing many, many copies of them on the PowerPoint that we'll be showing you shortly. So this is just a sample of one of the letters that had some letterhead with it of an eagle. A lot of them had letterhead, but some did not. They open up like this, had 3 or 4 pages. When they came out of the box, they were all mixed up, had to match them up by dates and handwriting and match up the story. My husband Brian scanned every page and I transcribed them. He was able to create a searchable database so we could match them up. And as the story was revealed, we learned that over an 18-month period from 1862 to 1864, Peter wrote 80 letters to Clarinda, and he described all of his experiences in detail in the Army of the Potomac's camps and battlefields. He described the Battle of Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, being confined in Libby Prison, and then a prisoner exchange camp. He was sent back to his regiment from the prisoner exchange camp and was then in the Battle of Wilderness, which you'll learn more about as well. Now, this is going to be a 30-minute pre-recorded video. It's a PowerPoint, which Patrick O'Connor will share with you. And the beginning of it, you'll hear me narrating and talking about Peter and Clarinda's history, a little bit about how I came to transcribe the letters. And then I'm going to, in the video, jump into being Clarinda, reading from the letters. You'll see the letters on the screen with the sections that she's reading underlined, so if you want to follow along. Presenting this from the point of view of May 1864, the end of May, just like today, she has not heard from her husband in a couple of weeks after hearing from him pretty much every week, sometimes twice a week for a period of 18 months. If you want to play along, pretend to be a friend who stopped by Clarinda's kitchen. Clarinda's going to talk about the letters, show them to you, tell you Peter's story, and then talk about where she is with trying to discover his whereabouts. After that, we'll close up for do a quick conclusion in which we'll tell you what happened to Peter and Clarinda and the letters. Following that, I have a short PowerPoint that details the Zouave uniforms, some of the sketches that Peter made of the Zouaves, some of his other sketches. I'll show you a little more detail, and just a little bit about how this dress was made, because lots of folks have been interested in the dress. Then Skip Griffiths is going to do his Zouave presentation and show us the amazing uniform that I'm seeing for the first time today as well. So with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Patrick O'Connor. He's going to show the pre-recorded video. It runs 30 minutes. If you would please, you just jot down your questions. He'll entertain them in a chat room after the presentation. Patrick?
Hi there, my name is Diana McCarthy. Thank you so much for your interest in my family's Civil War story. During an 18-month period from 1862 to 1864, my great-great-great-grandfather, Peter Dumont, wrote letters home every week while he was serving as a Union soldier in the camps and battlefields in Virginia. He wrote back home to his wife, Clarinda, and their 2 young children in Utica, New York. This is a scanned image of a small case containing daguerreotypes of him and his family before the war. I recently completed transcribing the letters for the first time. My husband scanned them all and put them in a database. The picture on the right is a scanned image of one of the sketches in the letters. Peter enlisted in the 146th New York State Volunteers Regiment in Utica in August 1862. He was 27. His regiment went to Virginia to defend Washington, D.C. He wrote 80 detailed and sentimental letters to Clarinda. He chronicled his experiences in the Army camps, in battle, and as a prisoner in a Confederate prison. Sometimes he included sketches such as these. Peter's wife, my 3 times great-grandmother, was named Clarinda. Her maiden name was Myers. Today I will be presenting Peter's letters from Clarinda's point of view. I'll portray her talking about the letters as she's working in her Utica kitchen. Before I begin to portray Clarinda, let me tell you a little bit more about her and Peter and how I came to transcribe the letters. Peter and Clarinda were born in the village of Seward in the farming country of Schoharie County in upstate New York. Peter was born in 1835 and Clarinda in 1837. Their families moved to the city of Utica separately when they were teenagers. Peter and Clarinda were married at ages 20 and 22 in 1857. They had their daughter Ida a year later in 1858, and son William 3 years after that in 1861, the year before Peter enlisted in the Union Army. Now let me tell you a little bit about how I came to transcribe Peter's letters. I grew up on a dairy farm in Prairieville, Columbia County, New York during the 1960s. My parents, my father's brother and family had all moved from their small farm in Massachusetts to start a larger farm together. My father's mother is holding me in this picture on the left. She'd been a teacher in a one-room schoolhouse in Massachusetts. It was part of my inspiration to become a teacher. I was the first child in the farm family. My parents moved us from this trailer next to the barn where I was born to a 19th century farmhouse. My brother Charles and my sister Marjorie were born. We had a lively household. It was on my mother's side of the family where the letters were passed down. Here's the family tree showing how the letters were passed to my generation. Peter and Clarinda's daughter's name was Ida. She's sitting on Peter's lap in this photo. Ida named her daughter Georgia after her husband George. Then Georgia named her daughter Ida. This Ida was my grandmother, shown in the second photo here with her daughter, who she named Ida too. The little girl here was my mom, Ida. All of these Idas have passed down the letters in a box over the years. Not shown on the family tree are many siblings, including my mother's brother William, same name as Peter and Clarinda's only son, and my brother Charles and sister Marjorie. They have all been involved in the stewardship of these letters. Marge made the dress I have on today and has been a partner in this project. I first saw the letters in a cardboard box at my Grandma Ida's apartment in Lee, Massachusetts. The pencil note on the top of the box reads, "War letters, letters from my father to my mother, 97 Lafayette Street, the place where I was born, Utica, New York." I believe the note was made by little Ida, who you saw sitting on Peter's lap. Grandma Ida was a widow, living and working on the Lee, Massachusetts farm where my grandfather had been a worker and where my mother had been born. So you can see my parents and grandparents on both sides were from Massachusetts. My family lived in the two-family farmhouse along with extended family and farm workers. This is my sister Marge with her calf, my brother Charles with his lamb. My mother's mother, Grandma Ida, died when I was a young teenager. My mother brought the box of letters back to our farmhouse. With everyone working and going to school, no one had time to organize the letters. The box ended up in a cupboard in this dining room. Over time, the box became covered with dust so that the writing was not noticeable. In fact, I didn't even realize it had writing on it until I went to throw it out several years ago. My mother gave me history books about famous women like Clara Barton. My father told me that owning the farm had been their dream, but that I should follow my own dreams. So I was determined to go to college and become a teacher. While in college in Albany, New York, I met and married my husband, Brian, who was already a teacher. We were married in the family's little church back in Prairieville. We bought a 19th century two-family brick house in the city of Albany and worked as teachers. One Christmas, while back at the farmhouse, I noticed the letter box in the dining room closet. I asked Mom if I could borrow the letters. I had the great gift idea to surprise her by typing them up in time for Mother's Day. Turned out to be harder than expected. The letters were so mixed up and hard to read. The story made no sense to me. I thought that both sides of my family were from Massachusetts and had come over on the Mayflower as English pilgrims. I thought that my soldier ancestor was a Massachusetts soldier, but his letters said that he was with the 146th New York Volunteers Regiment. So I told my mother about my failed Mother's Day gift idea, got her permission to put the letters in a bank safe deposit box. That's where they sat for many years. When Brian and I bought a house in the suburbs, we had room to spread them out, get them organized in file folders. Brian created a searchable database and scanned hundreds of pages of letters so I could transcribe them and understand the story. I went to the New York State Archives, rode off to Washington, D.C. to get military records, including this muster roll where Peter's service record was recorded. Have you ever found out something about your family history that didn't match what you thought you learned as a child? Through the letters and records, I confirmed that my ancestor was not a Massachusetts soldier, but one from Utica, New York. And he wasn't born in Massachusetts, but in Seward, New York. In fact, Peter and Clarinda were likely of German descent. So my family tree has German roots, not just English pilgrim roots. Census data from Seward show that Peter's father was an agricultural worker and Clarinda's was a farmer, like my parents. Peter and Clarinda apparently went to the same schoolhouse together. This is a photo of a schoolroom bench from the schoolhouse in Seward, where I believe they went to school together. In one letter, Peter wrote, "You know how you used to go to school with me once? I can remember how you used to look, with your little bare feet pattering along the road." Both Peter and Clarinda had several siblings who moved to Utica and are mentioned in later Civil War letters. When they all moved to Utica, Clarinda's family was in a mill town just outside the city. Peter's was living downtown, the same building as Harwood's daguerreotype shop. Peter's father listed himself and 18-year-old Peter's occupations as painters. I'm guessing adding color to daguerreotypes. Peter mentioned Harwood's daguerreotype shop in his Civil War letters. After their marriage, census data shows Peter as a laborer and then a canal boatman on the Erie Canal. Several letters in the box were from Peter to Clarinda before the Civil War. He wrote this one when they were just newlyweds. He was working on an Erie Canal boat. Part of the letter is quoted here. I'll read you the underlined parts. "My dear wife, we are down in Troy this morning and shall go down to the river about noon, so it will give me a fine chance to run around and see the place. We had our boat spring a leak and had to go on the dry dock. You must take good care of the little girl. You know what I mean, don't you? If you don't, I'll tell you what I mean when I see you again. Oh, you don't know how bad I want to see you. Oh, I want a kiss so bad I don't know what to do. So here is one for you." I circled the swirly kiss he drew for her. So sweet. After doing genealogy research, I think I know what he meant by the little girl. He was hinting at Clarinda's first pregnancy and accurately predicting that she would have a baby girl, our little Ida. When Peter was enlisted 4 years later, the job title on his muster roll was molder. It's a skilled tradesperson who makes iron parts in a foundry or ironworks. This is a poster from an exhibit on cast iron stoves at the Albany Institute of History and Art. It shows an ironworks in Albany. It shows the molding room of the ironworks and gives us an idea of the type of work Peter might have been doing. From references to the firm of Hart and Dagwell in his Civil War letters, I believe Peter worked for the Hart and Dagwell foundry in Utica when he enlisted. Census data showed that by the time she was 19, before she got married, Clarinda was also working. She and her 3 sisters were living in an apartment in the city of Utica. Their occupations were listed as in factory. They may have been working as mill girls in a textile mill. Clarinda wrote to Peter about sewing military coats and socks at home to make money while he was in the war. So why did Peter enlist in the 146 New York Volunteers in August of 1862? He had a young family who he adored. He had a new career as a molder. Perhaps this newspaper clipping from Utica provides some insight. Another military order. The following has just been issued by the governor. The draft for 300,000 militia called for by the president will be made on Monday, the 1st of September, and continued from day to day until completed. If the old regiments should not be filled up with volunteers before the 1st day of September, a special draft will be ordered for the deficiency by order of the president, Edwin M. Stanton, Secretary of War. Peter enlisted 3 days later. The Union had been losing battles. Newspapers reported about the Confederate Army making its way toward Washington, D.C. The social pressures to enlist must have been intense. A payment known as a bounty was offered to each volunteer. Clarinda's oldest sister's name was Julia. Julia's husband, Tom, enlisted in the same regiment as Peter. During that summer, right before Peter enlisted, Clarinda appears to have taken the children out of town by train for at least a month. She was caring for her sister Rose, who had just given birth. Peter wrote to Clarinda, describing how lonely he was. He talked about being strapped for money, how their landlord and the milkman were asking to be paid. In those letters, Peter begged Clarinda to come home soon. He told Clarinda about how her younger sister, Almeda, had also given birth and was not recovering well. I'll read you the underlined part of this letter. "Almeda is getting along quite smart, considering we have had such hot weather here. Almeda tires almost out. She is so much like a baby. She tries to have Bill stay home from his work, but he won't do it. Sam Holt tried to coax me off to some fancy house. When I spoke of duty to wife and dear children away from home, he laughed at me. There is some talk of drafting. Lincoln has called for 300,000 more men. They can't be got without a draft. Kiss yourself and the babies for me. For one who holds you higher than anything else on earth, my own Clarinda. From your own true Peter, come home as soon as you can without being out of patience with me." It wasn't until I found Clarinda's gravestone in Utica that I found her sister Almeida's grave right next to hers. 22-year-old Almeida had died while Clarinda was away, just days after Peter's letter. Almeida's baby, also named Almeida, died just weeks later. I can only imagine the emotions that 25-year-old Clarinda, 27-year-old Peter must have been feeling during those trying times. In a minute, I'll begin to portray Clarinda talking about Peter's Civil War experiences. For those of you who are interested in the Civil War battles, the 146th New York State Volunteers had a fascinating record of battles and service, which I encourage you to learn more about. The regiment served valiantly at Gettysburg, while Peter was confined in a prisoner exchange camp. Peter enlisted August 22nd, 1862. The regiment mustered in on October 10th and took a train to Northern Virginia to join the Army of the Potomac in the defense of Washington, D.C. Peter served primarily around Alexandria, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, and the Wilderness. I'm going to portray Clarinda working in her kitchen in May 1864. If you'll play along with me, please pretend to be a friend who has stopped by. Clarinda has not received a letter from Peter in weeks. She's read in the paper that his regiment was in a major battle with many casualties. Just a few notes about my portrayal of Clarinda. We don't have her letters to Peter, although she apparently wrote frequently expressing love and concern. All I know about her is from Peter's comments on what she said in her letters. I'm presenting her from my point of view, how I would have reacted to Peter's letters. While Peter was away, Clarinda seems to have been consumed with trying to take care of the children and survive on the soldiers' pay that Peter was able to send home. She sewed military coats and socks for cash. She continued to nurse baby William until he was over a year old. Shortly after Peter entered the military, Clarinda had to move in with his parents. For some reason, that did not last long. Without Peter's permission, she moved repeatedly to different places that he said weren't fit for human occupation. Clarinda did borrow money from Peter's employers, again without his permission. Peter often expressed concern that Clarinda was, quote, pinching herself too hard. He noted her frequent illnesses. She even got her first gray hair and lost a tooth at age 26. But he affectionately wrote, and I quote, take good care of Ida and Billy and also of yourself. And if you should happen to lose all of your teeth and your hair turn to white, I will love you as ever, as I promised before God and man. I know that Clarinda called Peter by his nickname Pete. Now, if you will play along, let's step back in time to Clarinda's kitchen in Utica in May 1864. By the way, I am wearing 5 layers of undergarments with this dress, which would have been normal even while working around the house. Oh, it's so good to see you. Thank you for stopping by. I'm so worried about Pete. I was just reading this last letter I got from him. He wrote it days before that big battle the regiment was in a few weeks ago. Listen to this. Dear Clara, I'm afraid before you hear from me again, there will be a hard battle fought with the Army of the Potomac. But wherever I may be placed, I shall try to do my duty as well as I can. I hope the Lord will spare us to meet again on earth. Take good care of yourself and our little ones. Give my love to all of my folks, and may heaven protect us all evermore. You know, back in March, he talked about deserting and coming home to take care of me and the children, and now he's disappeared. But I really don't think he would desert, not after all he's been through. And he's written to me about how soldiers in his regiment had to shoot other soldiers who deserted and were caught. You know, when he first went into the regiment back in 1862, he wrote to me about so many interesting things that he saw down south. But he also talked about how soldiers were treated poorly by their officers. He suffered so in the cold, and so many of them were sick and even died. This is one of his first letters. I can read parts of it to you. There are a great many sick ones here at present. They have a story around here that Forrest Phelps was drowned in the river on our way from New York. There is 2 other ones. I went over to Arlington House, lately the house or residence of the rebel General Lee. I picked some rose leaves from his garden, which I send to you. We have to lie on the hard ground with all our clothing on to keep from freezing. I don't see the fun in a soldier's life. It did turn out that Forrest Phelps and some others had deserted before they even arrived in Virginia, but they were caught. Pete really started to sound worried about the war right after that, when he and Fletch Dimbleby went to see the battlefield where the Battle of Bull Run had been. You know Fletch, he works with Pete over at Hart and Dagwell's foundry. Well, Pete wrote to me about it. The order was read that any man who fell out of the ranks on the march would be shot, and that sickness would be no excuse for him. This morning we marched on to Bull Run, 13 miles. After Fletch and me got supper, we went up to the battlefield. It was the most sickening sight I ever saw, and I hope to God I never will see again. Our soldiers were never buried here at all. They was throwed on the top of the ground, about a bushel of dirt throwed on top of them. Skulls and bones lay all over the ground, and hands, arms, legs, head, and feet stuck out from every grave. We went to bed tonight thinking of the horrors of warfare and all its dangers. Pete and Fletch were tenting together. Listen to what he said in this letter. I hope these few lines find you all warm and comfortable, which I can't say of us poor soldiers. This morning, the soldiers are suffering beyond description. It snows and blows, so we can't cook anything to eat. So we must eat bread and water. While I'm writing, Fletch sits in the tent, while eating some cold beans from yesterday and day bread. He says, tell the folks we're almost starved and froze to death. He says he has got enough of soldier's life. Then Pete ended up having to fight in his first battle, the battle at Fredericksburg, where the Union got beat so bad. One of his letters about Fredericksburg had the sketch that he made from the other side of the Rappahannock River, while our Union boys were bombarding the city, getting ready to go in. Right after this, Pete had to cross the river on pontoon bridges that our boys had set up. He got to Fredericksburg late in the day after a lot of our Union soldiers had been shot by the rebels. He had to sleep on the battlefield, and he wrote, oh, the dead and the cries of the wounded made me feel sick enough of war never to see any more of it. Then the next day, he and some other boys were trapped in the city. They didn't hear the orders to retreat. They escaped back over the Rappahannock River right before our boys tore up the pontoon bridges to keep the Rebs from following them. The regiment settled into a camp for the winter where Pete made this sketch, but the soldiers were still getting sick. They all had to get smallpox vaccines. One of Pete's tent mates, young Jacob Brush, died of disease. He wrote to me about it. Dear Clara, I done something last New Year's Day, which I hope I shall never have to do again. I made a coffin for one of my tent mates, Jacob Brush. Yesterday I put a headboard to his grave. He was a good boy and I liked him very much. I've written to his folks about his illness and death. Poor fellow, he had bright hopes for the future. Pete kept telling me about how other soldiers were getting boxes of homemade treats from home, but he said not to send one because everything would spoil. What would you have done? Well, Julia and I decided we should send a box, turkey and other goodies in it, for Pete and her husband, Tom. So we did. By the time the box got there, the turkey was spoiled, and Tom had gotten sick and been sent off to a hospital in Washington, so Pete couldn't share the box with him. Well, Julia was angry about that, so Pete decided to take what was left of the food and bring it to the hospital in Washington. He told me all about it. I went down to the General Hospital yesterday and found Tom looking pretty good. He seems to be about well, only he's very weak. He was tickled most to death to see me, and those things from home, he says he thinks he will live now. I'm so glad Tom finally got discharged to come home. At least Julia has her husband now. I miss Pete so much. He's always telling me that he dreams of being home. I was thinking about this letter he sent. I wonder if the children would know me if they could see me now. That is what makes me feel very bad, to think if I ever live to come out of this cruel war, my children will not know me. Yet I have some hopes that Ida will remember me. If I had have only known that they wanted going to draft, I should have been home this day with my loved ones. Pete felt so bad in the spring when they marched back around Fredericksburg and he saw the ruins from the battles there. He especially felt for the children. Listen to this. Poor little things, how I did pity them when they would come toddling through the snow, their little bare feet looking like coals of fire, asking for hardtacks to stop their hunger. Who could refuse that had any bit of human feelings left? I hope, dear Clara, never to hear or see you or my little ones suffering as I see them here. It was right after that Pete got captured in the Battle of Chancellorsville. He and Fletch were held as prisoners of war in Libby Prison, the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia. Pete wrote to me from Libby Prison, made a sketch of the camp they had set up before that. He wrote, "Thanks be to God that I am alive and well. I suppose long before now you were thinking that I'm killed or else taken prisoner. The captain told me to come with him and we advanced up as far as a rail fence. The captain jumped over it. I laid down, stuck my gun through the fence, ready to fire when they come in sight. The captain said he thought it was our regiment coming around to skirmish with us, but the brush was so thick you could not see them till they came right upon us. First I knew, Captain made a leap over the fence and about 200 balls followed after him. They fired in the direction I lay. It would have been certain death to me to have moved. I happened to look to the right of me. Along the fence there stood a rebel with his gun leveled at my head. To have withdrawn my gun back through the fence and fired at him would have been impossible. While Pete was in Libby prison, he made sketches in a Bible that he sent home to me. The sketch on the left is of the outside of the prison. The one on the right is of the inside. He said 350 Union soldiers were confined in a room that would fit 30. It was in the garret, and the tin roof made it so hot they almost died. If you went within 2 feet of a window, the sentry below would shoot you. The floor was crawling with vermin and lice. The water was too filthy for swine to drink. There was no privy or place to wash up. They almost starved, only getting a piece of bread and a piece of meat the size of an oyster every day. After several days, they were marched to an ocean steamer and sailed to a Union prisoner exchange camp. They had to suffer in the camp all summer in the hot sun, waiting for the Union and Confederate armies to exchange prisoners. He wrote to me about how Menzo Gibbs was killed when a shell took off the top of his head. He asked me to tell his mother not to try to recover his body, because if she found him, he was so mutilated she could not bear to look at him. He added, "You spoke about telegraphing for me. I don't know how it would work here. You can do as you think best about it. I don't think it would be a great crime, for there are no signs of an exchange very soon, and I might as well be there as here, dear Clara, anyway, to see you once again." Pete wrote, "I was talking with a man here last night. He said if a man was married and could show a good excuse, such as sickness or death, he might get a furlough. Oh, dear Clara, I want to come so bad. I listen for every word anybody says about getting furloughs. It seems as if I cannot give up coming anyway." I didn't know what to do. Do you think I should have sent him a telegram? Well, I did. I telegraphed him that little Ida was really sick. So he put in paperwork for a furlough, but he didn't hear anything for months. Peter felt so guilty about little Ida, us lying about her being sick, and he had a premonition we would be punished for our wickedness. He wrote, "I have had a presentiment since you sent that telegram that the Lord will punish us for our wickedness. But I hope for the best. I have not heard anything from that furlough since it went to the War Department, and that is a week ago." There was a draft that summer in Utica, which made the regiment bigger by fall. The regiment took in soldiers from the 5th New York and 17th New York. The combined regiment took on the 5th New York Zouave uniforms. Pete had been with the 5th New York a lot. The sketch on the left he made when he was promoted to sergeant. He was overseeing the 5th New York Zouaves while doing guard duty at a captured Confederate house. He called it a secesh house, and he called these slave children who they rescued young contrabands, because the Union had to consider them as contraband of war or else turn them back over to their masters. Then when summer was over, he wrote me this: "Dear Clara, I suppose I will have to inform you of the news that we are all exchanged. We'll have to go to our regiments." He ended it with, "Oh, dear Clara, my dream of seeing you this year has vanished, I'm afraid, but I still have hope of seeing you sometime." Maybe we were punished for our wickedness. Back in camp, Pete and the other soldiers got really busy. Guerrillas were raiding their camps every night and slitting soldiers' throats. I said, "Oh, we all hope for peace this winter, but the soldiers have suffered and endured so much through the folly of rebels. They all unite one another in saying that there can be no peace until every vestige of rebellion is swept from the face of the earth. All seem determined in their resolve. The feeling is far different from what it was last winter. Then they wanted peace on any terms, but it is not so now." Pete explained that General Grant had arrived to set the Army of Potomac in motion. He started hinting about joining the Navy. Sent me this little card of Admiral Farragut, Commodore Porter. He wrote me this in March: "Consider the heavy marches and loads we have to carry day after day, the broad canopy of heaven to shelter us at night, with Mother Earth for our bed and pillow. When I consider all these things, it seems as if the Navy would be far preferable. But, dear Clara, I am subject to your orders. I will not take any steps without your consent towards going into it. I don't hardly think there will be near the fighting there that there will be here this summer." The Navy people actually came and examined him. I pray to hear that he is safely at sea somewhere. This is his last letter, 7 days before the battle. He said that Burnside's men were marching to the front with 40,000 troops, and that among them there were about 10,000 black soldiers. He said he fears a hard battle will be fought, and he hopes the Lord will spare us to meet again on earth. He's not listed in the newspaper as killed. One paper said that 350 soldiers from the regiment were missing, killed, or wounded. This is another, where Fletch wrote to his brother that Dumont is missing. Fletch's brother sent the letter to the newspaper. So many men are missing. I'm hoping Pete got away or was captured like happened in other battles. What happened to my Pete? What can I do? Thank you for listening to me, my friend. Hi again, this is Diana back in the 21st century. In the letterbox, there were several letters that were not Civil War letters. Finally figured out that some of them related to Clarinda's efforts to find Peter, and others told of her fate. Clarinda's hard battle to survive and take care of their young children must have become even more difficult. She was trying to find out what happened to her Pete. For years, I continued to hold out hope that he had survived. I learned that the Civil War was the first in which pensions were provided to widows and orphans. Pension agents advertised in the Utica paper. They would help widows find information and fill out the pension applications. Clara Barton, the famous Civil War nurse and founder of the American Red Cross, set up an office of missing soldiers in Washington. She published lists of missing soldiers in newspapers, asking survivors and others to contact her if they knew what happened to them. One of the other letters in the box turned out to be to Clarinda from a pension agent in Utica, and he forwarded this July 3rd, 1865 letter from Clara Barton's Office of Missing Men. It states that another soldier had seen Peter killed in the Battle of the Wilderness over a year earlier, and signed by Clara Barton. My husband Brian and I made a trip to Washington, D.C. to meet with the research director of the Clara Barton Office of Missing Soldiers Museum. She provided tremendous information, verified that the letter was signed by Clara Barton. Seen here, one of my childhood role models. We visited national battlefields at Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, and the Wilderness. Here's Peter's December 1862 sketch of the bombardment of Fredericksburg and a May 2015 photo we took from the same spot. You can see the same church spires are still visible. It felt like the Civil War really wasn't that long ago. We saw many graves of unknown soldiers, and toward the Battle of Wilderness to Saunders Field. We learned from National Park Rangers most of the deceased and wounded 146 New York soldiers' bodies were burned in brush fires on Saunders Field, which is shown here. At the time, it was a heavily wooded area. The wildfires were ignited by the fighting. After all these years of searching for Peter, we learned that Saunders Field is probably his final resting place. I learned from military records that Clarinda received a small pension for herself and little Ida and William. She never remarried, but lived in various places with William. 2 of the letters in the box were from William to Ida, who had married and moved to Massachusetts. The letters were about their mother, Clarinda, now age 44, being sick with malaria, an insect-borne disease. Found Clarinda's grave in New York Mills, a mill town outside of Utica, where her parents brought her as a teenager. She was buried right next to her sister, Almeda. So little Ida had moved to Massachusetts, kept the letters in a box, passed them down through the generations until my mother, Ida, became the steward of the letterbox. Mom was still working on the farm when she became ill with Lyme disease, also an insect-borne disease, like malaria. She had medical complications and declined over a period of years. The birth of my sister Marjorie's son was joyful for all of us and reinforced a sense of history for me. Mom passed away from complications and Dad died suddenly a few months later. They were buried on the same beautiful spring day under the same gravestone in our hometown. Before Mom passed away, we discussed the future of the letters with family members. Finally decided that because Peter was a New York soldier, we would donate them to the New York State Education Department's archives and the State Museum and Library. The staff there were so helpful with researching and cataloging the letters and daguerreotypes. Here the letters will be safely preserved and accessible for all. I truly appreciate this opportunity to share our family Civil War story with you. Thank you for your attention and support. Here are just a few of the many people that have helped with this quest. My thanks and apologies to the many people who are not listed here. You've all been so kind. Thank you again, and please feel free to reach out to me with any questions or additional information. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much for running that video for us, Patrick. I wanted to show you a few more slides about the Zoas and the sketches Peter made of them and some of his other artwork as well. And lots of you know way more about this than I do, so I'm going to give you the nutshell version and ask for help at the end from Skip and Mark. Now, the Zouaves were French soldiers in the Crimean War. And it's just amazing to me that my grandfather, who was a very common laborer from upstate New York, would end up wearing this flamboyant North African style uniform. He seemed very fascinated by it too. These are some French soldiers in Zouave uniforms during the Crimean War. This unit was supposed to consist of Algerian volunteers from the Berber tribes who had a great reputation as fighters, but it also ended up including French and other European soldiers. They served with distinction, and there was a lot of interest in their uniform and fighting style back here in the United States. The Crimean War, I've never known much about. It was pretty complicated, but it was fought on the southern tip of the Crimea, which is a peninsula extending into the Black Sea, barely connected to the Ukraine. And had a valuable, the siege of Sebastopol was so famous that Peter even mentioned it in one of his letters. The war and the Zouave fighters were well known in the United States. So it was definitely something he might have known about. And you can see here their distinctive uniforms with the baggy pants, the open front jackets, the sashes, and the fez-like headdress. Now, how do we know about the New York connection? Our very own Colonel Elmer Ellsworth brought the Zouave uniforms to our attention when he ran a drill company called the Zouave Cadets. And he was born here in Malta, grew up in Mechanicville, was always interested in the military tactics and uniforms. He moved to New York City and then Chicago, where he met a surgeon who had served with the French Zouaves in the Crimean War and taught Ellsworth bayonet drills and salutes. They established a military drill team in Chicago that used the Zouave drilling and fighting techniques. And they toured the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic. He served as a law clerk with Abraham Lincoln, became a close friend of Lincoln's and campaigned for Lincoln. Ended up setting up an early Civil War regiment, the 11th New York Fire Zouaves. They were primarily Manhattan firefighters with no prior military experience. Ellsworth was the first Union officer killed in the Civil War when they marched into Alexandria, Virginia, removed the Confederate flag from a hotel on May 24, 1861. He was killed by the hotel owner. His troops killed the hotel owner and removed Ellsworth's body, which lay in state in the White House, then New York City, then here in the Capitol in Albany, then sent back for burial to the Hudson View Cemetery in Mechanicville. A statewide Zouave regiment was recruited to avenge his death. That's the 44th New York Ellsworth's Avenger. Now, I have an idea that my ancestor might have known about the Zouaves before the war. As I mentioned, Ellsworth's Zouaves toured the Northeast. They went to Utica, they came to Albany, and in 1860, they were in Utica when this painting was made. You can see the Chicago unit in the center, New York unit in the rear, and the Utica brass band in the foreground. Now, I'm just guessing about this, but I know that Peter often wrote about going to 4th of July parades, the circus, other festivities in Utica with Clarinda. So maybe they had been to go see this together, or at least they knew about it because they read the newspaper all the time. Here's another sketch that shows a little bit more about the detail of the uniforms. Now, we here in the DeBuffs are very fond of the Albany Rural Cemetery, and Mark Bodner is on our board and their board and is going to give you some more information. Colonel Ellsworth is not buried in the Albany Rural Cemetery. My ancestor, Peter Dumont, is not buried in the Albany Rural Cemetery, but there are 14 New York soldiers buried there who served in various units, and he can review that with you a little bit more. Some of them were with the 5th New York Duryea Zouaves, who Peter came to know very well. These were named in honor of their founder, who was Colonel Abram Duryea. They mustered in May 9th, 1861 at Fort Schuyler in the New York Harbor and mustered out May 14th, 1863, right after the Battle of Chancellorsville and before Gettysburg. They were scheduled to complete their service right before the battle, and some did leave, but others had reenlisted or had remaining service and were to become part of Peter's regiment. They convinced the military authorities to allow them to retain their Zouave uniforms. So the 146th got new uniforms and received some additional training. And Skip Griffiths can tell you some more about that in a few minutes. And Peter first encountered them when he was promoted to sergeant and was assigned to oversee a unit of them. And the units were getting ready to be merged and were serving together quite a bit. I'm gonna see if I can zoom in on this a little more. You saw this in the video, but it's kind of a cool picture. The note says young contrabands and Secesh House with the Duryea Zouaves on the picket. So the contrabands are the formerly enslaved persons who escaped and worked with the Union soldiers. These are children. They were designated as contraband of war by the Union, so they didn't have to be handed back to their former slave masters as required by law. The Secesh House is the secessionist house, and these are the Duryea Zouaves on picket duty. So he was with them March and April of 1863. On March 10th, 1863, he wrote, "The boys swear they won't wear them big pants, but military power will make a man do most anything down here." And then he made at the end of the letter a sketch with a picture of the Zouave fighter and says, "From your husband ever until death, good night. A kiss, the best I can do now." So the 146 became a Zouave unit when they received the members of the 5th New York in May 1863 after the Battle of Chancellorsville. Peter was in Libby Prison and then the prisoner exchange or the parole camp. Now this is a wonderful book, regimental history, originally written by Mary Genevieve Green Brainard in 1915, recently re-released by Patrick Schroeder. New materials and lots of photos such as this one on the cover. And we were fortunate at DeBuffs to have Patrick Schroeder as one of our guest speakers. It shows the members of the 146 in their Zouave uniforms. And the foreword to this book is written by Brian Pahanka, who I understand was a strong member of our organization. The uniform consisted of sky blue Zouave jacket with yellow trim, fez with a yellow or red tassel, sky blue Zouave pantaloons, and a red sash. Now, this Bible that Peter had in Libby Prison, another soldier had given it to him. He had taken it from a Confederate. I'm not sure how that happened, but they used it almost like a yearbook, making sketches and writing little notes to Peter. And Peter used it to sketch this little cartoon. And it says, 5th Regiment, New York Volunteers, Duryea Zouaves. My name is Sergeant Frawley, 5th New York Vols, Company K. And the picture is of General Joe Hooker. This uniform was issued, as I said, while he was in parole camp. And on June 20th, he wrote, "I've seen our new uniform. It is the most curious looking rig you ever saw." Now, this is a spectacular painting done by Keith Rocco. He's an incredibly talented painter. I was fortunate to correspond with him, get permission to use this photo because it means a lot to me. Let me zoom in on this one for you. This shows the 140th and 146th New York Volunteers at Saunders Field. It's got the Zouave uniforms in full color. More importantly, it almost makes me feel like I'm there. The first time I saw this painting, it was on a national park marker at the Battle of the Wilderness site. It was entitled First Blood at Saunders Field. The 146 was nearly wiped out in the Battle of the Wilderness. Frederick Pfister reported 312 casualties, including 65 killed or died of wounds, 57 recovered from wounds, and 190 missing. National Park Service says that the number of dead was undercounted. Most of them were listed as missing instead, partly because they didn't find the bodies, but also because they didn't want to erode Northern support for the war during the election year of 1864, where Lincoln's opponent, McClellan, was running on an anti-war platform. So this could contribute to why Clarinda didn't know what was going on for almost a year. According to the National Park Service's website, battlefield website, the Battle of the Wilderness was largely fought in a dense forest of young trees and undergrowth, igniting by bursted shells and fueled by dead leaves and dry shrubs and timber. The flames quickly spread. One fire moved out of the woods into Saunders Field, consuming the dead and the wounded. So I had to, at that point, accept that I was probably not going to find a gravestone. I was probably not going to find that Peter had somehow escaped and that this was his final resting place. So we have the talented painter Keith Rocco, and I'm pretty proud of my ancestor Peter Dumonts, some of the paintings he made. And people have asked, how could a common soldier, a laborer in a ironworks be such a great artist? And one of the factors is that at that time, in the one-room schoolhouses, people were taught to sketch. And it appears that he had a high school education at least until he was 16, and Clarinda probably until she was around that age. When he went to work in the daguerreotype shop as a painter, that was his address when they first moved to Utica. That was the address that little Ida wrote on that box. That was a daguerreotype shop, and I think he probably had some experience there. But also in working in the ironworks as a molder, he would have seen the cast iron stoves and other implements with all of this fanciful decoration, the beautiful banners and arches and patriotic symbols, which were common art and architectural designs at the time. You can see those comparisons. This is an eagle with eagles everywhere in his sketches. And this is one from a cast iron stove. These are a couple others that he made. I'm going to zoom in on this letter where in the closing of this letter, he had been promoted to sergeant and appeared to be very proud of it. He made a sketch of a bird that had a banner reading, "To those I love at home." And he proudly signed it, Sergeant P.L. Dumont and Lady. I wanted to see how this would look. So he was kind of proud of his promotion. In his early letters, he talked about the horrible conditions in the regiment camps, sleeping in shelter tents, freezing. But later on, they made more established camps, and he was very proud of them. And he put in all the flourishes and patriotic symbols and the eagles. He was very proud of those and seemed to be unhappy every time they had to leave one of the camps. And in this letter he wrote in March of 1863, "Dear wife, I am well at present and hope these few short lines will find you all enjoying the same good blessing. We have been to work fixing up our camp, and I thought I would send you a picture of it. We're going to have a Zouave uniform. They took our measure yesterday for them. Most of the boys swear they will never wear them big pants, but military power can make a man do almost anything down here." Now this is a tranquil winter camp scene. It's a winter scene on Potomac Creek, Virginia. And it doesn't really match his descriptions of freezing, disease, eating cold food, shivering, but I think they got themselves pretty well established. In this letter, it was in January 1863, they had just barely escaped from the Battle of Fredericksburg in December of 1862. And the regiment had been ordered to move in anticipation of a battle, but they got stuck in the mud and were taunted by troops on the other side of the river. The soldiers were complaining about Major General Ambrose Burnside, who they blamed for their defeat at Fredericksburg. I'm going to read you this underlined part down near the bottom. Peter said, "Every soldier I talked with swore up and down that he would never cross that river again under Burnside as long as he lived. It is calculated by men of good judgment that the army has lost about 40 or 50,000 men, besides our pontoons, wagons, horses, and a good many other things. It seems as if the soldiers has about made up their minds to settle this war themselves. There were whole divisions that never lost a man before by desertion, that lost nearly half this time. Oh, I pray they will soon end this war and let us come home where our hearts and minds is on, and not on the battlefield. There was a time when our men were fighting for the Union, but that has all passed away now, and their minds are bent now altogether on going home." Now in this sketch you saw before, I'm going to zoom in on it. This is the one he made while he was in Libby prison, and then finished the letter when he got to the parole camp. My feeling is that he was reflecting back on his camp's home-like setting and wishing he could go back to his regiment, because in Libby prison, he would have been sitting on the floor in this sweltering room without enough food or water. He said he was eating coffee grounds to allay his hunger, and somehow had the energy to make this sketch and write, "Thanks be to God, I am alive and well. I suppose long before now you were thinking I'm killed or else taken prisoner." In Liva's letters, Peter wrote about making pocket money by drawing sketches for other soldiers to send home, and by whittling decorative pipes out of laurel bush roots. He told Clarinda that others called him the whittling Yankee. He also talked about playing his fiddle back when he was home. I don't think he had it with him when he was there. I didn't inherit any of that artistic or musical talent, but some of my family members did. Peter tried to write poetry too. That one wasn't so good. He wrote little love poems like this one. "As I walk the Sentinel's midnight beat. Let's get a closer look at it. As I walk the Sentinel's midnight beat, I think thou art always nigh. My prayers and thoughts are all of thee, my only love, goodbye. And then he wrote that it was original. At the bottom of this letter, the PS said, the statement of Captain Moore is a correct one. There is no boards to be got to make a coffin of. The one I made for Jacob Bresch was of 3 hardtack boxes fastened together by poles under the bottom. There is a good many buried without coffins. There's such a contrast between this sweet love poem and this chilling report about the burials of people without coffins. So finally, speaking of talented artists, I want to tell you about how my sister Marjorie Linko made this beautiful house dress for Clarinda. And it's actually called a wrapper, which is a morning house dress. It's like a dress that would be worn while doing small chores in the morning, feeding the children, writing letters. And it goes on over the layers of undergarments that would be still worn later in the day when the woman switched to a regular dress. She probably would have had an apron on over the wrapper too. My sister Marge made this garment out of yards and yards of material, a lot of hand sewing, hand wrapped buttons. It took months of diligent work and several fittings, and we just had a wonderful time with fittings. It's some of my fondest memories of our adult years of friendships as sisters. Now all the undergarments and hats and jewelry were given to me by a new friend, Maxine Getty, experienced reenactor. I got lots of advice from our club members, Laura Spickerman, Wanda Birch, and also from another local reenactor, Phyllis Chapman. Everybody wants to know what are the 5 layers of undergarments, so here they are. That's why I'm sweating so much right now. Pantaloons, chemise, corset, crinoline with hoops, and a petticoat. So again, these are just a few of the many people who've helped with this quest, shall we say. My apologies to the many others who are not listed here, and my thanks to all of you. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Skip to talk a little bit about his Zoab uniform that he's wearing today.
Thanks, Diana. All right, I'm gonna ask my wife to I don't know if everybody can see this. I want to, Pat, how do I put this for me?
Put it on to you, you mean?
Yes, so that everybody can see it.
If people change their view to speaker view, it'll go on you. You have a camera lens on your device, and it's
Yep.
going to say flip it back and forth. The camera is going to be, I'm trying to see here where you would bid it. Let's see. That is, you should be down where it says start video. It may give you your camera lens options there.
Yeah, I don't have it because this is an iPad.
Are you using an iPad? Flip the iPad sideways. Yep, there you go. You're all
Great.
set.
All right, can everybody see me?
Go over here.
Yeah.
Yes.
Just there's a finger over the lens right now. There you go. Okay, you're good. Back
Right.
out. Perfect.
We'll start from the bottom up. So keep going. Okay, you notice that I have put it down a little farther.
Well, how do you want me to open it?
No, turn it towards me. Like this.
Yep, right there. You can see him.
Okay, I got the shoes, the Brogans. They were all factory made. Not very well made. Some of them they called shoddy. They fell off after a day or two or a week's march. You'd have to get new shoes. I have the white is called leggings. They protect me going through brush. The leather also protects. They are called jambières, hence the French. My pantaloons, they're bulky, almost like wearing sweatpants. And the soldiers that wore the Zouave uniform actually liked wearing these better than the volunteer blue that the regular Army wore, and the other volunteers. I have a half jacket with a wool shirt. This thing is hot as all get out. On here you see I'll get closer, D5. The D is the company that I would have belonged to. 5 is the 5th New York. I wear a half jacket, which isn't that binding. And then I'd have my accoutrements attached on my waist. No, in my sash. I'll show you Peter Dumont's uniform. I'm gonna turn it around. This is Peter Dumont's uniform. I'll get closer. You can see it's sort of like the one that I have, only it's blue and yellow. My uniform that I'm wearing is closer to the French Zouave than this one. What I would have been wearing would have been Louis Napoleon's Palace Guards. This is the 146 uniform. Again, leggings, jambières, and you'll notice that the pants of the 146 are not quite as baggy as the ones that I'm wearing. Let's see if I can get it better. These would be more of a chasseur type cut, which is still French. A wider sash than I wear. And then the jacket similar, only yellow. These are first sergeant stripes. And the fez would have been the same. Like Diana said, it would either have a yellow tassel, or they just discovered that some of the tassels at the 146th wore were actually red tassels. The reason why the 5th New York went into the 146th New York is because being one of the first regiments from 1861 through 1863, they signed 2-year papers, enlistment papers, and during the 2 years, the 5th was also recruiting for more volunteers as they were getting shellacked during the battles. Those guys were either new recruits in 1863, or they had been fooled into signing 3-year papers. So about, I believe it was about 300 of the 5th New Yorkers were transferred into the 146th New York. The 5th New Yorkers, when they were transferred, refused to take off their Zouave uniforms. A lot of them wore out, but you'd see the 146 jacket on a pair of red pantaloons. You would see the blue pants with a dark blue jacket like I'm wearing. Those were the 5th New Yorkers. When they refused to wear the Zouave uniform, that's when Colonel Garrard, who commanded the 146, petitioned Washington for the Zouave uniform. Now, the 146 received their Zouave uniforms on about a week before the Battle of Gettysburg. So when they were on Little Round Top, they had their Zouave uniforms. Now, a small fact that not many people know is that on the front of Little Round Top, all those regiments up there were actually Zouave regiments. The 44th.
Can you back your camera up a little bit so we can look at the uniform a little, like back it up so we can look at the whole uniform? There you go. Yeah,
Okay.
just like that. Yep. Thank you.
Take the chair out of there. The 44th New York, the Ellsworth Avengers, the 12th New York, the 146th, and the 155th Pennsylvania up on Little Round Top were all Zouave regiments. The only two regiments that were up there that weren't Zouaves was that there were some of the Verdun sharpshooters who wear the green uniforms, and Hazlitt's Battery, the artillery. This uniform from the 146th is actually taken from direct measurements from a 146 uniform that is in Hudson in the Daughters of the American Revolution Museum. And Diana showed a picture of the 4 146 guys in uniform standing side by side. The guy that's standing second from the left is Chauncey Smith, and that's whose uniform is up in Hudson. I guess I'll shift it over to Mark for Albany Rural Cemetery history. Anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Go ahead, Mark.
Okay, thanks, Skip. Yeah, when Skip and I have colluded before about the 5th New York interred in Albany Rural Cemetery, and we agree on 5 men from the what was it? 5th Verrier Zouaves that are interred there. So I went through my list, and I have to apologize. I never counted up how many guys from the 44th New York are buried in Albany Rural Cemetery. But other than the 44th New York, there are 14 total Zouaves, men that served in Zouave units. 3 with McChesney Zouaves, that was the 10th New York. 1 with the 73rd New York, which was the 2nd Fire Zouaves. There are 3 from the 9th New York, that's Hawkins Zouaves, and 1 from the 62nd New York, Anderson's Zouaves, and the 11th New York has 1. They were Ellsworth's Zouaves. But what I did, although I didn't get a chance to do the 44th, and there were a lot of guys from the 44th because a lot of them were recruited right from Albany. But I counted up the Albany Zouave cadets. Now, you may have known that Elmer Ellsworth brought his Chicago Fire Zouaves on a tour around the East Coast, and yes, they did. I think Diana had alluded to it. They stopped in Albany, and they gave a presentation in what's now Washington Park. It used to be a burial ground, by the way. It used to be called the State Street Burial Ground. Now it's Washington Park. But the city officials thought that this was such a great idea, and I think it was 1860 that they were there, that they thought it'd be great if they started their own Zouave militia unit. And so they created the Albany Zouave Cadets. There's no list that I know of that lists every man that served in the Zouave Cadets. There is a good book out on it, and he does give certain lists, but buried in Albany Rural Cemetery, I've counted 21 men that served in the Albany Zouave Cadets, and all but 1 went to war. The one that didn't he became a physician, but the rest of them served in like the 43rd New York and Albany Regiment, 44th, of course, 121st New York, 96th New York, 177th New York. This one guy served in the 54th New York, the 44th New York, and the 18th New York Cavalry. So, and here's one guy, 113th New York Infantry, which went on to become an artillery unit. So the Zouaves were a reckoning force to be dealt with. They were very steeped in training. And what did they call it? The Manual of Arms or something like that, Skip, when they would go through those?
The Zouave bayonet drill.
The bayonet drill. I happened to be at Gettysburg one time with my wife, and we were over by Spangler's Spring. If you've been to Gettysburg, you probably know where that is. And I think there were maybe 8 to 12 Zouaves there going through the bayonet drill. And oh my God, it was amazing. These guys were really good. They must have been practicing a lot. They were really good, and it's a great show. So if you ever get to see that, I would say do it. That's all I
So
got.
Brian made us practice a lot so that we were proficient in it.
Mhm.
And there's one, I forget which reenactment it was, but it was 6 o'clock in the morning. The sun was just coming up and we were on a hill doing the bayonet drill. And everybody looked and said that was the most beautiful thing they've seen
Yeah.
in the morning. It was just fantastic.
It is. It's outstanding. So maybe you guys can get together and come up here and go through the bayonet drill. If we eat outdoors at Swifties.
I'll get Russell to do it.
Skip, thank you so much for sharing those uniforms. That's the first time I ever saw the 146 New York uniform, and it really touched my heart and meant a lot to me. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Great. Okay, does anybody have any questions? I did see one in the chat room. Mark Bodner had asked if how did Peter Dumont get his education, because he seemed, very very erudite for a typical soldier. Is that pretty much what you were asking, Mark?
Yeah, his letters are very eloquent. And so I was asking Diana if she knew where he got his education and how far he went.
It appears to have just been that one-room schoolhouse, and I think he was 16 or 17 when they left for Utica, and he went straight to work in a daguerreotype shop with his father. His father had been a farm laborer, but I guess back then you could change careers and start new things, and there must have been some artistic talent in the family because they were both listed as painters. His sister Malvina went on to become an accomplished daguerreotype artist and is actually listed on websites, and she used to send him different colors of pencils for sketching. For the writing, I know that he had asked Clarinda for comments on his writing. Did I do a good job? Excuse my spelling. I'm sorry about the grammar. He never used a period or any punctuation at all. So that's why a lot of the transcription took many, many years to do, trying to piece it together, which was common at the time, but his grammar was excellent. I didn't really edit that. And I think it's just, back then, a one-room schoolhouse, a great teacher, maybe from Albany, I'd like to guess. I want to learn more about that. And comes in and teaches both Clarinda and Peter, and they supported each other. They both read the Utica newspapers all the time, and he even quoted out of the New York Times. So they did a lot of reading too. Some of it he might have copied, some of the flowery language, things that they were hearing. It's hard to tell, but I think Bob Mulligan has shared a lot with me about soldier letters, and I'm kind of proud of my ancestor, but I think a lot of folks had learned to read and write, although many did not. And Peter wrote letters for other people, including his brother-in-law Tom back home to the wife Julia. So he would, take dictation and write the letter for him.
In one of the slides early in the presentation, it alluded to Arlington Heights on October 20th, 1862, Camp Seward. The very first unit that was sent down there was a militia unit from Albany. They were the 25th New York State Militia under the command of Colonel Michael K. Bryan. And I don't remember how long they were there. Perhaps Bob Mulligan would remember, 30 days, 90 days, whatever it was. But they established their camp, the first camp down there, and they called it Fort Albany. Now they were out of there sometime later in 1861, but I thought it was very interesting that at the same place. We had Camp Seward in 1862. And by the way, many of you probably know that Arlington Heights is where the Pentagon is located today.
Yeah, the Military Museum in Saratoga has the camp flag for Camp Albany in their collection.
Oh, do they?
It's one of the flags that they have restored recently.
Oh,
Now, Stuart, did you see the other comment in there from Rosemary?
No, I haven't yet. Let me just back up into the chat room. Oh, here we go. Oh, if you want to know more about Ellsworth and the Zouave Cadets, the Roundtable Congress YouTube channel has a free program on Ellsworth and the Zouaves, which was presented earlier this month. That's something worth looking into.
And Kathy O'Brien just chatted.
Okay. Oh, I'm amazed at how Peter was able to write such beautiful letters and sketch those drawings under such duress, explaining how they were so hungry and cold.
That is really true. And he talked about laying on the ground or trying to take a piece of wood and make it as a lap desk for himself. He was always complaining about how hard it was to write and asking for paper. He even wrote on paper that had letterhead from other regiments and even out of state like Ohio. So they were always sharing paper and doing the best they could.
I can't write legibly if I haven't had my coffee yet. So it must have been a real skill to do that in a freezing camp.
Regarding his education, I think if you remember, or I've read that the education of the average student in the 1850s and 1860s was probably equivalent to what a junior college student today has. I mean, they had grammar books that were just specific, and he must have got a good basic education from what his letters showed.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that some time ago I did a program for the Buffs on my galvanized ancestor, Patrick Bradley, who was enrolled as a Confederate, deserted, and joined the 146th. And he also mentioned that he had received the Zouave uniform, but for him, fortunately, he joined after Chancellorsville, and he joined after Gettysburg, and then was released from service prior to the Battle of Chancellorsville.
I would love to correspond with you about that. That's exciting to think that they were writing about some of the same things.
Yes.
That's great.
Okay. Anybody have any other questions? I don't see any in the chat room. Feel free to just speak up. I think we can. We don't have so many people here that we can't just talk back and forth there. Well, if there's nothing else, I do want to thank you, Diana. It was a great presentation, and
Thank you.
And thanks to Skip for your Zouave insights, and to Mark. Also, many thanks to Buff Secretary Pat O'Connor for his tech expertise that made everything possible. Thanks also to the I know several of the other board members had a role in setting this all up, so thanks to everybody. Before we close out the evening, I do want to put in a word about the next program, which will be on July 28th. That program will feature Michael Barrett, notable historian of Troy, 19th century industry, and Oakwood Cemetery. The program will be titled "A Million Horseshoes a Week, the Burden Iron Company in the Civil War." Find out how steel horseshoes made in Troy, New York ensured the victory for the Union. Yes. Well, one further note, we're still looking for a speaker for the September 22nd presentation. If you have a topic that you're looking to explore, or you know somebody who has a good Civil War themed presentation that's looking for an audience, please let us know. You can contact Program Chair Mark Koziel, and he would be glad to set it up for you. So we look forward to seeing everybody at the next presentation, whether that's on Zoom or in Swifties or somewhere else. Only time will tell, but hopefully we'll be back together other than virtually soon. Thanks to everybody for attending. And have a safe, healthy, and a thoughtful Memorial Day weekend. Good night,
Thank you,
everybody.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Stuart.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you, Diana. That was great.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks,
you.
Diana.
Thank you all,
Fascinating.
everyone. Yeah, that was wonderful.
Thanks.
Take care.
Happy Memorial Day.